Welcome to More Music Please, Quarantine Beat. We're exploring how the music industry is staying busy and keeping connected during lockdown, and also just talking about whatever. I'm your host, MK. Let's get started. On the line with me today from Boston, Massachusetts, he is in Bouchard and the Dedications. He's a member of Salem Wolves. And I want to say you've won some Boston Music Awards and whatnot, just active in the Boston scene. It's a very old friend of mine, Bouchard. Welcome to the show.
Hello. And I should first start by clarifying. I've never actually won the awards, but I've been nominated a bunch of times. And I think this is the year. This is it. It's me.
I always think being nominated is just as good. I was nominated this year for a Music Director of the Year award among my radio peers, and even though I'm no longer a music director, I was like, oh my god! Like again, they nominated me afterwards. I was like, that is so lovely. It applies to like, the previous year.
I've totally found. Yeah, I found the same thing. You know, like we've been nominated for the Boston Music Awards, which is a pretty whole event, or at least it was when there were actually events. It takes place in the House of Blues on Lansdowne. It's like huge, 1,000 people, like, and really like it's very much just the scene comes out and kind of like celebrates itself, and it's really exciting to see all of your people who you've been playing with throughout the year. It's a super. What I really like about it is that like they've made a real big push the last few years to be much more diverse and expand sort of the types of music that is being highlighted. It used to be very much like old school like rock and roll oriented, which Boston's kind of a rock and roll kind of town, but I like that now they're really moving into like other genres and things like that. And it's exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting to be there.
I think my only other point of reference for a Boston area musician, I don't know if you know her, but there's a girl, Aubrey Haddard, who is she splits time between kind of here and Boston. So I knew her from like bands in New Paltz, but I know she's active over there too. And she's very different from what you do. So, a scene that can embrace her and embrace you is a pretty cool scene.
I I won't take too much credit for being super embraced, although people have been very kind to us. And yes, I definitely know Aubrey, and she's awesome. It's weird, like you sort of cross paths with everybody. It's a big city, but sort of in some ways a smaller scene than you're expecting. So yeah, we've definitely crossed paths over the years.
Yeah. So what's it look like in the Boston music scene right now? I mean, tell me about kind of your musical lockdown experience so far.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously, no live events have happened since I don't know, like February, March at this point.
Yeah.
And at this point, we're not really sure what live music is going to look like. You have little spots here and there. There's a venue in Somerville, which is once. Somerville is the name of the venue. They are actually starting to experiment with entirely like virtual shows where there'll be a performer on stage and a very small filming crew. And they actually film this person. It's usually, I think they've only done it with like acoustic and solo performers so far. I don't know if they can support it for more than that many people, but and they sort of broadcast it on Facebook and to their YouTube channels. What I've been doing in lockdown basically has through my band, we're all pretty lucky in that the guitar player in the band, Eric, he is actually our engineer and producer on the album. So he has a lot of musical knowledge and is a great engineer and mixer. So what we kind of set out to do this experiment of sort of what would happen if we recorded a bunch of songs remotely, and we actually started with a couple covers, which we don't actually usually do. We usually pretty much are pretty hardcore only originals, but we started with some covers and they actually came together really well. And so we've been doing basically a mix of remotely recorded, mixed, and video covers that we'll put together. And actually just today, Monday the 29th, as of this recording, we actually just put out our first original of in this sort of performance model. And that's been something that we found we can do, and it's relatively easy for us. We all have the ability to record remotely our parts. It's what we try and do is we try and keep it pretty live. Like if there are mistakes, or if there are, if it's a good take, mostly we just kind of keep it to that, and we don't do a lot of mixing. I mean, we'll do enough mixing to kind of present it as a finished piece, but we don't do a lot of like after the fact effects or anything like that. So we try and make it feel live and exciting, and it's about as close as we've been able to get to the live experience. And it's fun, but it doesn't take the place of playing live music, which I really, really miss.
Of course. I think it's a good approach to try to, keep it sounding and feeling as live as you can, because we're all missing live music so much, those of us who play it and those of us who, love to go see it, and both. And nobody knows when it's going to be back. So I think, as much as it might feel like kind of a pale imitation for you, and, hopefully not as much for the listeners, but it's all we got right now. So
yeah. Well, to me, it sort of was born in response to a couple things that I was like thinking about, especially when we first all kind of went to our separate homes and started to shelter in place. I was doing kind of an acoustic, just a song every single day, usually a cover of something, and I would go through certain songwriters. Like when things first started, I was doing a lot of Warren Zevon, because he has a song "Splendid Isolation," which it immediately came to mind. I was like, oh, this is Splendid Isolation. And that was fun. Then I started to see like a lot of people start to do live streams, and it was definitely, you saw like people really like, how you saw the people struggling to be like, how do I do the thing I love and entertain people and make them feel good when my options just logistically are limited? And so over time, when I was doing these acoustic songs and just in my room, and I felt like, part of the live thing is the energy. Well, like you said, like it's the energy, it's the passion, it's the sweat of other people in the room, which now sends chills down my spine.
Of course,
thinking
that's the whole problem.
And because of that, I felt like we needed to heighten things a little bit. Like, it needed to be more than just like I'm sitting in my guest room playing a song I really like. Not that that's bad, because I've seen plenty of awesome, heartfelt streams that are just that. It is more like for me, and partially also because I'm, I'm an old school entertainer. I'm a song and dance man. I wanna kind of like put on a show, and as part of that, I felt like, okay, how can we heighten this somehow? And this sort of model came to mind. And the other thing that's pretty grim for the Boston scene especially is, we're facing, the closure of a lot of our venues now, because the Boston real estate market is so out of control that, venues who have been forced to close and really don't have a model to bring back or engage with live music and thus their customers and the scene, they're getting squeezed out by the insane prices of real estate. And why? And so we had like the closure of this awesome, historic venue, Great Scott, that just closed, and basically the people that own the building were trying to force out the venue as a tenant, and people did a fundraiser to try and offset costs and reopen it, but it didn't work, because it's like a multi-million-dollar piece of property that they want to turn into either student housing or expensive retail. And a venue just doesn't, like a rock and roll venue doesn't fit in what they think the city should be. So we're really facing a lot of that, which is, it's hard to look at from afar, and you're like, well, what do we do, aside from raising millions of dollars and trying to run this thing ourselves, which just there's not a lot of infrastructure to do that.
Right. And I mean, again, you're still facing the problem of, even if you could do that, when will we be able to have crowds gather again? So God, it's such a shame. This is why I have the format of the show only talking about music for the first part, because I'm like, there's just not that many positive things to say right now. It's all
Yeah,
looking pretty grim.
it is great. Yeah, it's tough because it's like, and with Great Scott specifically, and which is really just unfortunately just kind of a symptom of the disease that's really hitting the city, which is like, you know, it sucks because it's predatory. In some
Yeah.
ways, it's like we're in the middle of a pandemic, and this venue that's been open since like 1974 and has been like, and truly like a life-changing place. Like
Yeah.
I remember in college, when I was in college in the city, like I knew people in my circle who had played at Great Scott and just felt like holy. It was amazing. The idea of thinking of how you play Great Scott, because it was just so cool, and like you'd have like cool national headliners play there that weren't quite like ready for a large room like the Paradise or now the Sinclair, and it just seems so cool, and I was like, oh, like, I would just love to play that. That's like a lifelong dream. And then years later I was able to do so, and it was great. And I've been very lucky to do it a couple more times. And actually the most recent band, like we had our number 2 show there, and it was sold out like and we were the opener, and it was sold out by the time we
Wow.
started playing. It was insane.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was, and it's just like it's that place that had a vibe, and people associate it with good music. So people are likely, if it's like a nice night, people are likely just to come off the street to see what's happening, even if they don't know you, or they don't know the headliner. And that, like, there's not really and even beyond COVID, which has sort of just been been sort of the prelude in some ways. It's like kind of like the reason that they're able to do this. But there's just people in the city, and the cost of everything, and the cost of living, cost of real estate, it changes the character of things, not just in a kind of like, oh, it's gentrifying sort of way. It's like, no, it changes. There's people, this sounds sort of conspiratorial, but like there are people who have intent for these spaces that does not align with a bunch of scrappy kids like screaming their lungs out at like the best show of their life.
Oh, there's nothing conspiratorial about it. It's very real. I mean, look
Yeah.
at what happened to New York City before you and I
Yeah.
even got there, I mean, and we would hear the stories of like, oh, this neighborhood used to be so cool. There, CBGB was long gone by the time we got there. Or maybe it went like shortly after and got turned into a high-end men's fashion boutique.
Yes. I
you
remember
know and
that.
yeah, like all of that kind of shit. And like, this does not happen by accident. This happens
No.
because there are real estate prospectors watching like hawks, and they don't care that like a rock and roll venue gives a neighborhood character, or gives it charm, or gives it, a place for broke people to hang out. In fact, that's the problem, is that it's a draw for broke people.
Yes. Oh my God. Totally. Exactly. And like, and they've been like on this for years. And like the people who own the property, it's like, well, there's people living around here, so noise. And it's like, and but I know countless people who have lived right above Great Scott, and are like,
Yeah.
yeah, the noise doesn't bother me.
Yeah, it's
What
like the
does
venue
bother
was
me is
here
turning this
before
into a
you.
convenience store for college kids.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we're facing the same thing in my little corner of upstate New York, where, I mean, I guess it's maybe a little bit on hold because of all of this, but we have
Yeah.
this part of town that has a few good music venues and cool things going on. And there's this building that's been sitting unused, and they want to knock it down and put in this massive, like apartment slash shopping complex that's going to completely change the character and the look of the entire neighborhood. And we're all like, oh my God, can you please not? But there's no stopping it, because the people behind it are so well funded and so well connected. And we can go to town hall meetings and put up a fuss, but ultimately, all we can do is stall it a little bit.
Oh yeah, the wheels of progress will roll over us all. Like, and
Yeah.
it is like, it's a steamroller, and it's so. And part of that, like part of what I think about, because especially because I know so many people who are in the city or in just outside the city, and are just racking their brains as to thinking like, and like Great Scott was really felt like a big deal, because it was just people thought like, how could this be touched? How could this? It's been here so long. It's such an institution. How could this be? And what happens next? And the reality is that like the culture of Boston is going to filter out. Like, so I've been spending a lot of time in a Providence, Rhode Island, which, you know, it's another state, but it's less than an hour away from the city. And the scene here is very different. It's in some ways it's a sort of old school scene, and you can tell because, like, you know, when there were shows, the shows still lasted until like 2 or 3 in the morning. Like that's like New York in 1973 like times. That's like you don't see that, and like, you know, especially in a city like Boston, which, you know, now like the trains stop running at midnight, or at least you know, they did in the before times. So like I do think that what will happen, and this is like a cold comfort in some ways, is, you know, what will happen is you'll see people filter out of the city, filter into like more into like either the North Shore, you know, Western Mass, so places like Worcester, or even like as far as Northampton, which is like a couple hours outside the city. And then like also you'll have people, you know, coming down to Rhode Island, Providence. And I think you'll see, well, you know, but then progress is just going to catch up. And so it's like, to me, what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to think of, and I'm not exactly the right guy for it, because I'm not the deepest thinker in the world on this stuff, is just like, how do we break this cycle? Like, how do we preserve culture in the face of commerce? It's and I know that's like that's almost an unanswerable question in terms of just the logistics of it and the infrastructure we got to build, but it's essential, because otherwise what happens? Like, otherwise everything happens on Facebook, and it's already happening on Facebook, you know, because we have to remote record everything and do these live streams. But it's like, I don't know, man. I get uncomfortable thinking about like, oh shit, like Facebook, I guarantee you, has algorithms that have me facially tagged forever. Like, if ever a picture of me pops up on the internet, there's something that can tag me, Gray Bouchard, probably link it to my social security if they really want to squint.
Oh, totally.
You know, how do we stay out of Big Brother, man? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Oh God, you know, part of me wants to go down this rabbit hole, but my last episode we entirely spent the whole time talking about late stage capitalism, and I'm really excited about the topic that we picked for today. So I think we should leave that with you know, listeners out there. Think about it, because it does depend on all of us deciding that we have to do something. So I know that, you know, my audience is you know, made up of like-minded people. So, you know, let's figure it out while we all got some time to sit around and think about how to overthrow capitalism.
Absolutely, that's a call to action right there. And on the subject of capitalism.
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit about, you know, New York City, which is where you and I first ran into each other. I was 18 and working at St. Mark's Comics, which is another landmark that is no longer in the world, although not because of COVID. They just, Mitch shut down. Last year, was it that he shut the doors just because he was done?
It was. I think it was even. Yeah, it was technically last year, though. I think it was like probably pretty late in the year. Like, you know, it was pre-COVID, but maybe like even around December or something like that. Just couldn't. Yeah, I think he just couldn't make it work anymore.
I think he was just probably tired of trying, because it was a tiny independent comic store in the East Village right on St. Mark's Place, and I can't imagine what his rent was like, and it wasn't
oh my God, insane.
And it wasn't even a good space. I mean, there were always problems and flooding and, you know, structural issues. So I'm sure he was just like so ready to be done, and I hope he was able to, you know, cash out and is living comfortably and much more easily now, because he also kept insane hours. You know, the store was open until like 2 a.m. some nights, which was part of what made it so cool. But that was where I first met you. And, you know, obviously we are both fans of kind of, well, let's say broadly comic book culture. And I will get into, you know, where I'm at on that right now. But where are you on comic book culture right now? Do you still have books that you read?
So yes and no. So I kind of I've always had a very intense love-hate relationship with comic book culture, and I'm glad that we're talking about. I love talking about it as culture because I love comic books as a form.
Mm-hmm.
I am from basically when I could read, or even before. Like I've been drawn to just I love comics, and I just think as an art form, it has so much potential. It's kind of in some ways the oldest art form, like in that it is visual and it is broadly representative of something having to do with like the human experience, in terms of the stories that it tells.
Yeah.
And I say broadly because we might have to talk about how it goes a little bit afield from that. But I've always loved comics. I remember back when I was a kid, I was reading Spider-Man, which was like my first entree into the whole world of comics and superhero comics and things like that. I was reading Spider-Man at a family reunion, and I had this aunt that was, I was very sort of conservative, religious woman. I think she was, just generally sort of, had a very sort of specific worldview, one might say. And she saw me reading Spider-Man, and she comes up to me, and she has this like really nervous look on her face. And she's like, you don't believe that, do you? And I'm looking at her and I'm like, I think I'm like 10 years old. I'm like, I'm trying to even understand the question. Like, just like, well, believe it? Believe. He asked me again, you don't believe in that, do you? And I'm like, believe in Spider-Man? Like,
Like,
I don't know. And like,
do
that's
I
kind of,
understand the concept of fiction? Is that what you're asking?
I understand the concept of fiction, or it felt sort of loaded because she was sort of like she liked to I would say preach in some way. So it's like I think she got nervous that I would think Spider-Man is Jesus Christ or something, or that like I would worship him in some way. And and arguably there are comic book fans who start to veer that way, and that sort of keeps me, I think, a little bit separate from the culture, and that I love comic books. I love superheroes. I really do. But also, I find a lot of the culture of it to be so like worshipful. It's really about like it's just like these. In some ways, the culture to me represents like the powerless person, usually male, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
who sort of fetishizes the ability, like hyper ability, having
Right.
some kind of ability to be beyond themselves. And I totally, I understand that, coming at that from a young age, and it can hit you in a certain way. Like I definitely was like, well, the reason Spider-Man appealed to me is like I was a nerdy kid,
Mm-hmm.
and like I like this idea that this nerd Peter Parker, like who everyone picked on him and stuff like that, like he got superpowers, and he could be this wisecracking, kind of jumping off the walls kind of guy, and that
Yeah.
that really appealed to me. At the same time, I was lucky in that, like, for whatever reason, like, that's the sort of toxicity that can come from, craving and worshiping power like that
Totally. It's a
didn't
power
infect
fantasy,
me.
and it's completely understandable why it attracts, the underdog a little bit. And like for my part, so I was never into superheroes. It just didn't resonate with me, and I mean that could be because I'm a girl, and obviously they weren't really geared towards me, and all of the, there were always some token female superheroes floating around, but they always felt token, and
Yeah.
it didn't really appeal to me. But comics as an art form very much appealed to me, like you said, and I was always like a very artistic kid, and I loved, the different art styles, and I think it's such a visceral and effective way of telling a story when it's done right. So when I went to work at the store, I didn't know that much about any specific comic books. I was just kind of into like, nerd culture in general. I was into like Star Wars and anime and stuff. So I was like, oh, I'll fit in here even though I don't really do superheroes. And I got really into like Why the Last Man and Fables. Like there's some really incredibly creative and beautifully written and illustrated stories that, are not the superhero thing. And yeah, but before we jump into those, I do want to kind of explore this superhero topic a little bit more because yeah, I think what bothers me about them is exactly what you just explained, where it's kind of this like, underdog power fantasy that I think, like, I am not a believer that, like, video games cause violence, and I don't believe
Yeah.
that Spider-Man created incels, but I do think that the type of person who veers toward that incel mindset of like blaming external forces for their own social failures and blaming women for their inability to get women, so to speak. I think they do kind of they're drawn to that sort of superhero power fantasy, and they don't have the awareness to understand why it appeals to them, so they kind of use it as like a confirmation bias thing, of like, oh, see, if I could just do this, then I would deserve the hot girl, which
Absolutely.
which leads to
I agree 100% on that. And I say that as someone who, entered the world of comics through superheroes.
Totally.
And just for, like to give my nerd credentials here, I actually so I say Spider-Man is like the first hero that I was drawn to. I came into comics in the 90s, and I am old, yes. I came into Spider-Man specifically at what is considered to be like the I think it's the nadir of basically his thing, where the comic book fans will know what I'm talking about, the Clone Saga and Shudder. It's like this whole convoluted era in comics where the comic book industry is basically realized that there was a collector's market, and so comics were a license to print money, and they wanted crossovers and they wanted to restart series. So like, even though Spider-Man had been in 800 issues of Amazing Spider-Man before that, there was a #1 issue that had a hologram cover and everyone had to get it and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It was commercially and creatively really challenging. And like what you're saying about sort of the adolescent power fantasy, that really kind of, I think that really, I don't want to say it took hold then, because I think it's always been there, but in some ways I think you see it especially in the very loud and persistent rejection of progress in comics and sort of
Yes.
progressive themes. And
Yes.
you look at just take Spider-Man. Like, you have so many dorks, and I'm going to call them what they are, the fucking dorks, who just think that Miles Morales as Spider-Man is some sort of taint. And believe me, I think that they think that for a very specific reason, because he, but if you think about the essence of what a character like Spider-Man is, as Stan Lee invented him, back in the 60s, he's a poor nerdy kid out of Queens.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think in 2018 or 2020 that's a white guy? No.
Yeah.
So
not necessarily. Yeah. And I mean, he's supposed to be the everyman, and I think
yes.
there's a lot of insecure young white men who kind of can't handle that not every man is a white man and is not necessarily a man, and there's this kind of sense of like, well, I'm the default, like, if you're trying to include women or you're trying to include people of color, then like, you're just virtue signaling, because like, obviously white man is the normal setting. It's like, no, like, you're a minority.
Well, and the other thing which is crazy about that too, which is exactly right, is that like, as comics have really has been commodified, and part of this is very much typified by Marvel is now Disney and Disney is now Marvel. And the biggest, as comics have become this commodity, this IP to be mined by a company. Alongside that, and this is something that I haven't fully explored or thought about, so this is a little bit of an unformed thought, but it's been starting to creep in my mind recently a lot. I feel like that has come alongside the toxicity of sort of quote unquote nerd culture coming to the fore, and around this sort of proprietary nature.
Proprietary is a really good word for it. Yeah, they feel very proprietary over it, very protective, that kind of sense of like, I had it first. And you see it in music too, with like, oh, I knew that band before they were cool, and like hating on them because they're popular now. And I understand that to an extent, but yeah, it gets taken to this extreme. And like, yes, with the whole Disneyfication of the format does come a dip in quality in some cases, of course, but that just means, go looking at the imprints, go looking at the indie comics, go find something that's still underground, that's still interesting, and accept that, everybody's found out about Spider-Man.
Well. So the other thing too is I will actually, and I will even challenge what you just said, and go a little bit of a different way. I'm not necessarily a person that thinks the commodification of it is innately bad. I mean, I think that capitalism is evil, which is, that's an issue for your last episode. But I think that in some ways, to me, I think it's just about it's the idea that a person feels ownership, and that this a character, a story, an idea has become an IP. Yeah. And it's that transition from, because here's the thing, I believe that there are probably a billion stories you can tell with Spider-Man or with the Avengers or with whatever. If you are brave and if you are able to give this to creators who are innovative and sort of progressive in terms of the storytelling and the storytelling they want to do. I think when the problem is that when stories become IP, become a property to be owned and to be mined and ostensibly to make money, then you can sell it to a person who then feels like they own it. And that person, the loudest of them all, is these toxic young white guys who just get upset when anything challenges the stories they feel like they own. There's all this "you've ruined my childhood" stuff. We've seen it in comics. When Thor becomes a woman, when there's when there's a Spider-Man who's a person of color, when they add more, like, I think they're stupid, but like, I don't have a problem with them making new Star Wars movies. It doesn't bother me.
That's a great example, because I loved Star Wars. I was like really, really into Star Wars when I was in like middle school, high school, like, a little bit embarrassingly into Star Wars. And, there was a time when I was like, probably around middle school when, that's sort of the mindset. Like, that's the time when it's sort of understandable to have that mindset, that whole like, well, this thing is mine and brr, 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 it's so important, because you're in middle school and your brain isn't fully developed. So like, I had a little bit of that. And, I think I was like, to the extent where like I went online and bought the VHS copies of the unaltered original trilogy because I wanted them without the changes. And I was like all up in arms about like, oh, the CGI and Han shot first and whatever. So like, I get it. I get the mindset. But, I've seen all of the new movies and some of them are fine. And I actually just finally got around to watching the last one. And you know what? It sucked. It was a bad movie. But so what? Like, it doesn't really have any bearing on my life or anybody else's. It's a piece of entertainment. And
exactly.
If I in my head want to pretend that wasn't even canon, I have the freedom to do that. And people get so
it's totally it's this failure of imagination. It's this failure of memory too, because part of what I've been doing lately is I've in addition to some select series that I'm reading, both independent and mainstream, I've been returning to the comics that I read as a kid, and a lot of those were, and this is where I need to, half of my world is the superheroes, and I love that stuff too. But then, like, also alongside the first Spider-Man comic I ever read was, and this was probably an awful idea and has impacted the person that I am in strange ways, but like, a weird random issue of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing that, has people picking up tubers that are psychedelics and eating them and having horrifying hallucinations, across the astral plane, and
that's
and stuff
the weird
like that.
Shit I like. I was into manga a lot when I was younger. I guess I should say manga. I don't know, but I was really into that, and like, that was pretty. There was some weird dark shit that I was reading when I was like pretty young, and I'm glad I did. It's all so creative and interesting, and and like, even sometimes I'll go online and like, I don't know if you like, oh God, what's his name? Junji Ito.
Oh my God, Junji Ito is my man. He's like, so I'm not a big, like, I sort of am, manga for me is kind of the final frontier, and not because of any particular thing, like, objection to it. It's just that it's, first off, it's so expansive. There is, and that's actually part of the beauty of manga as a format, is that they have decided that there is space for everything and any type of storytelling.
Yeah, and I love it. And I mean, I don't even read that much. Like, I'll go online sometimes when I just want to be creeped out and like read some Junji Ito shit, or like,
Oh yeah.
there's a bunch of like Berserk books that that are my boyfriends that are sitting downstairs that one of these days I'll get around to reading. I've seen the show, but I haven't read the manga, and I understand it's like supposed to be crazy. So yeah, like I love all of that shit. It's all interrelated, and like you introduced me to like Scott Pilgrim, which I'm sure if I went back and read them, I would have my eyebrows raised at certain points. But like they
Yeah,
were
he's
so
like
fun.
it's funny thinking about Scott Pilgrim because like first because I mean I love that series and the movie is to this day like one of my favorite movies. It's a great rock and roll movie.
Yeah.
But also basically the definition of a toxic borderline abusive relationship.
Yeah, where he really like romanticizes the idea of this person without actually like, which is a very like Michael Cera movie type of plot. So he was very well
yeah.
cast in that role. But it was such a dynamic and fun and fast paced and like irresistible read. Like it was, yeah. I'm not at all shocked they made it into a movie. I've never actually sat down and watched it because by the time it came out, I was kind of like realizing some of the issues that I might have with it. But yeah, I'm sure it's great.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, kind of going back and sort of reappraising some of the things that I used to love as a kid. For instance, one of the big series for me was Transmetropolitan, which is by Warren Ellis, who is having sort of a Me Too reckoning, and it's complicated now because it's like, oh, it's like you hear this is a person who's the books I read and loved, and I thought he was a genius and innovator, and you realize like, oh, he's had this sort of toxic impact on the people around him in such a way that I find pretty unsavory. So it's interesting, kind of, but also that's part of the comic book culture too that we have to reckon with, is that it was a very toxic culture. It was not very open to women, and people of color, and people of different identities than just straight white men.
Yeah.
And because of that, you get the words are tripping on my tongue, but I gotta say them. You get predators like Warren Ellis,
right,
protected and insulated against the consequences of their actions, and they get to do it over and over and over again. And meanwhile, we're all like hailing them as just sort of like difficult geniuses,
right.
And so it's in some ways I'm happy that Alan Moore just seems to stay out of the public spotlight and just want to write his weird Lovecraftian sex comics and have his in worship snakes, because it seems like he's not going to be outed as an abuser.
Well, hopefully he's not one. Yeah, but I mean, and yeah, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you said that. But there also, I do want to recognize there was always a side to comics and graphic novels that was really inclusive and that was very open and diverse. I mean, I remember St. Mark's, there was like the section in the back where we didn't let the kids go, and it wasn't all just porn. Some of it was like queer comics and like furry shit, which like is not my thing, but like it's cool that it's out there and it exists, and a lot of that was very gay, and like there was something for everybody, and sometimes it was obviously very far out of the mainstream, but I do think that's one of the great things about it, is that sometimes you have to look a little bit, but there is something for everybody.
Well, and that's the classic story of the independent scene, across really any media, whether it's film, whether it's literature or zines, like you start to get those voices once, in independent, and specifically independent comics, because there's not the gatekeepers, like there's all these different, you can find like different voices, different styles, different perspectives, and I did really love that. There was like a furry comic that came out recently that I actually really enjoyed, which is it's so funny because it's very weird to say that out loud. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I'll come up
well,
with
you
it
know
before
what?
the
Like,
end of the podcast.
I will put in a word. I've spent enough time on the internet to know that not all furry stuff is pornographic. So there's nothing wrong with like reading and enjoying a comic about anthropomorphic animal people.
Of course, yeah. It's just like it's just a different thing. It's like and what I do, I take a lot of, I think that perhaps what I've been doing lately is I've been taking refuge in sort of the older comics I used to read, because like I don't know. And also too, like the industry's in a really weird position right now. So, part of what I think about sort of the comic book industry, because I love it as a format so much. And I think about it a lot where, with COVID, the brick and mortar comic shop is really in a tough spot for a lot of different reasons. One, you got, people don't want to come in there. They're it's the same thing with any retailer. But then also the big two, DC and Marvel, they stopped shipping during COVID, and partially, because of the supply chain and everything like that, it wasn't really safe. But honestly, partially because if they felt like there was a dip in sales, then the IP wasn't as valuable to them. And Marvel and DC, respectively, knew, and actually, like DC started to ship a little bit more recently than Marvel did. I think Marvel like just started last week, so they had like a 2-month period where they just didn't ship comics.
Wow.
And there were no new Marvel comics. And Marvel just sat back thinking, well, we got that Disney money.
Right.
Like who gives a fuck? Like people are on Disney Plus right now, like watching our movies, like we don't need the comic arm of this. And it started to make me think like, oh man, like even as a person who like understands how crass and commercial it can be, it started to make me think like, oh, are all these characters and all these stories good for just IP mining? Like, are we so creatively bankrupt that we just need to find a proven story and a proven character so that we can essentially scale up our operations? And you start talking like a real like a real parent of industry there, where it's like it sucks. It's like, okay, like I think that there is magic in these characters, like and you also too, I shouldn't be too hard on it. Like, you got movies like Into the Spider-Verse that is like super cool and like definitely like very relevant. It feels very like
that one was good. I still haven't sat down and watched it because again, I have kind of like a superhero aversion, but I do hear that that's the one to watch.
It is. It totally is. And it's like, and it's cool because it actually like it's a meta commentary, and everyone, and believe me, there's nothing more annoying than saying it's a meta commentary. I sound like a comic book fan at this point. But like it's a meta commentary on like how like Peter Parker as Spider-Man is old and tired and just like,
and they just literally made like 3 series of movies with 3 different Peter Parkers, didn't they? How many times can we watch Uncle Ben die?
when they recast Peter once again as just another white dude. Now that kid whose name escapes me because he's just. It could be Timothy Chalamet. It could be Daniel Radcliffe. It's just like a white English actor who's gonna try and do a New York accent. So like when they recast him as that and like didn't go in the direction of like Miles Morales or like or even just like, man, you could cast him as anything. Who gives a fuck what his name is? Who gives a like, he's just. All this is a prompt for ideas and stories, or at least that's all it should be.
Yeah, which is why, like, even though when I was working at the store, this used to drive me a little crazy, where it would be like, all right, the next big arc is coming out, and everybody's dead, and blah, 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 and I'm like, oh my god, wow, they killed off all these characters, and then, the next arc, and they're back. Like, it would drive me a little bit nuts, but, like, I understand, it, like you said, it's a prompt. It's using these characters, in all these different ways, and yeah, it's, if you take it for what it is, it's really great creative writing. But yeah, and I agree. I think, we saw young, white, nerdy Peter Parker. Let's see something different, Let's see Peter Parker the talking rat. I don't give a fuck, but like, let's see something different.
Now, to be fair, they do have Spider Pig, so that is a very specific. or no, wait, I'm sorry, Spider Ham. Spider Pig's from The Simpsons. Spider Ham is Peter Porker, I believe, is his name.
Is this canon?
Canonically.
It is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's canon.
Oh yeah, Spider Ham, the spectacular Spider Ham. He's a whole deal. He's literally from an alternate universe in which, and I'm gonna try to get this right. And believe me, if I was on Twitter, the nerds would roast me. He was he was a spider that was bitten by a radioactive pig.
That would kill a spider.
Yes, it's God bless comics. God bless comics.
Yeah, that's hilarious and great. I love that exists.
Yeah, no, that's he actually, I think he plays a prominent role in Into the Spider-Verse as well, and that's kind of like, and that's why I think that movie's awesome, because it's like it just doesn't, it plays fast and loose in a way that the sort of MCU, which I know was, I think, a topic of our conversation that we I don't know if we even have time to get into them.
No, we do. I was about to bring it up myself, because I think what you're about to say is kind of how I feel, and I know you like some of those movies, and I understand, why people do. Like, they are fun, they are fast paced, the people are very attractive in them. I get it. Like, they're high budget, they're well done. My problem is they're all pretty much the same. And like, I also, like, I'm not a huge fan of like CGI. I really like practical effects. So like, that's part of it, contributes to everything kind of looking and feeling the same to me. So like, I mean, and I don't always hate comic book movies. Me and my boyfriend have watched a lot of like action movies from like the 80s and 90s recently, and we did Barbed Wire the other night with Pam Anderson, and like it was dope. Like, it was was it a great movie? Was it a great cinematic feat? No, but it was fun, and it was fast paced and action packed, and Pam Anderson looked great with her synthetic hair, and like it was interesting. It was all, I don't know, it just looked better than the new flashy, smooth, slick Marvel shit to me.
Yeah. Well, so my feelings on the MCU are complicated, to say the least. So I feel, so I am totally a patsy for them. I'm in the tank, and partially because of the sort of visceral, like, they tickle the like nerd, the like me at 12 years old, a super Spider-Man or Marvel nerd sort of thing. Like, they just tickle that sort of instinctively. So like, when you see all the characters lined up in a row, right, about to fight, like Thanos, and there's a pause, and then you hear Avengers Assemble, like, it works on me. It totally works on me.
Mm-hmm.
And it works on me the same way. And I would say that, and I think this is the best metaphor for it, it's like, it works on me the same that like McDonald's like works on me. It is loaded with salt and fat and sugar, and it tastes so good, and it's the same every goddamn time, the same place that every McDonald's that you eat at, a Big Mac's gonna taste like a Big Mac. And and maybe that's a little reductive. Like, obviously, when you knew me, I was working in New York City. I was worked for Troma, and one of the main Troma dudes is James Gunn. So, and he, they gave him Guardians of the Galaxy, and he did something a little quirky with it. And, it was quirky within the realm of like a big studio, but I think he's a great, him and other people that they've worked with who have been able to do this. And I'm not talking about kind of like the tent poles. I'm not talking so much about like the like the Avengers or the Avengers Infinity Wars, or the kind of things that like have to serve this purpose of like massive like world building and years of payoff. And those are commercial efforts. But like, you get like a Guardians of the Galaxy. They threw what they knew at the time to be a nothing IP. It didn't mean shit to them. Like, who gives a fuck about Rocket Raccoon and like Star-Lord? Like, these are not characters that Marvel had a particular amount of faith in.
They're
so they gave him to a weirdo.
Names yet, which is, I mean, you're right, and it worked, because I still haven't seen the movie, but I know what Groot is.
Yeah, and what they, and that's, to me, that's the way that the MCU works and can work. I think that they're moving away from it piece by piece, which is a little bit unsettling. I think that they go back and forth, like, so what I like is that early on, and to an extent, like, later on, they had more comfort playing fast and loose with, because they just had a library of IPs, essentially, is how I would describe it as a studio exec. And the Spider-Mans of the world, the Captain Americas, the Avengers, that's, they're gonna put some more thought into that. They're gonna like focus group all of them, but like no one cares about Star-Lord. So like, yeah, let's give him to this weird guy that used to work for Troma. He has this thing Slither, that did pretty well, looked pretty good. He can play with CGI. We'll give him a bunch of money, like we'll give him a couple million. It's nothing to us, but it's everything to to him, and let's see what he does. And the reason you haven't seen the movie and you know who Groot is because because a person with a idiosyncratic storytelling perspective was given the chance to do something, and that's a testament to like let the weirdos play. And I think that and on another element of it too, like you and I'm also not the guy to talk about this, but I will anyway because I'm a comic book nerd. But like that's where the triumph of Black Panther comes in. You have a cast that is almost entirely people of color. Mm-hmm. You have a director like Ryan Coogler who like obviously has an eye and knows storytelling, from Creed and the other movies he's directed, and Fruitvale Station, I believe, is the other one. He just like that was such a juggernaut. And largely because and that's not the same thing as like, oh, let the weirdos play. That's like, why don't we try one movie where it's not just this fucking parade of people who are white and named Chris? Like what? like
so
literally,
many Chris's.
Literally, most of the the majority of the Avengers are named Chris.
I know, it's so I was so not to go off topic, but I was bitterly disappointed when I found out that Chris Pratt was kind of a douchebag because I never saw the movies, but I loved Parks and Rec, and obviously he's so funny and ridiculously handsome, and I was like, he's like a weird Scientologist or something. That's a letdown.
I know he's got like weird. He like attributes everything to like weird prayer and stuff, and it's like I just want to be like, okay, Chris, sounds kind of really like your whole things about prayer and stuff sounds kind of regressive, but okay, I'm gonna just pretend.
Such a letdown. But anyway, to get back to Black Panther, which you were talking about, I did see that one in theaters because it was a cultural, it was like a big cultural moment. Like, there's a huge mainstream, enormous budget, entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is one of the biggest IPs in the world right now. And it's not, as you said, a parade of white Chris's. So I did go to see that one, and I enjoyed it. It was a good, solid superhero flick. It didn't change my life, but if I were a young black girl going to see that movie, maybe it would have, like to see myself represented.
And that's kind of like and I don't want to give them too much credit. I don't want to be overly praising literally the largest company in the world that owns the box office at this point. I shouldn't. It's that's a little irresponsible. But at the same time, it is heartening to know, okay, this is the space that we're going to play in. Comic book movies are going to be the tent poles of movies, whether or not we like them or not. But the idea that they were willing to give rise to different voices, and you're exactly what you're saying, which is like, it's important because representation matters. Representation matters so much. And, like in some ways it ties into the essential elements of what like dudes like Stan Lee really thought back in the 60s, where it's like the reason he made Peter Parker a teenager, which actually at the time was relatively uncommon. There were teenage sidekicks, but not I think Captain Marvel predates him, but he was a kid who turned into a big strong man. But like Peter Parker was a teenager and he had teenage problems, and Stan Lee had talked a lot about this, saying like, I did this because I knew that the person buying the comic was a teenager, and I wanted them to see themselves in the hero. And before it became toxic, before it became a power fantasy of being able to basically hurt the people that hurt you, it was about showing like, hey kid, you probably have like 5 cents in your pocket and you want to read something, why don't we give you something that's about you?
Yeah.
In some way. And like, and the key to comics having value throughout like as we continue through time, the key to that is keeping that essential element there and not allowing the gatekeepers and the people who own the IPs and the most toxic version of the fandom to not have that essential element of representation be stopped from being progressive.
Yeah,
because representation is innately progressive.
It's so important, and I think the biggest testament that I can think of to representation being so important is how closely guarded it is by, the vanguard of white guys who want themselves to be the only ones represented. And I think, God, if we could just normalize different types of people being the main characters of their own story, I think we would solve so many problems within a couple of generations. As we were talking about before, you are about to have a daughter, and I have decided not to have kids, but I do have 2 nieces, and I cannot wait until they're old enough that I can show them the She-Ra and the Princesses of Power show on Netflix.
That show is so great too. I love that show.
Oh, and
that's and speaking of independent comics, Noelle Stevenson.
Yeah.
She did so many great. She did Lumberjanes, which is awesome. She did Nimona, which is I think a web comic. I don't know if I think they've subsequently published it. But yeah, no, you're so right in that we need this. And I think about that, and I don't want to be like one of these guys be like, I think about representation for my daughter.
Right,
I feel like there's that's a whole thing that you get from a lot of stoic dudes.
I can vouch, you gave a shit about women before you had a tiny one about to drop.
yeah, but it does sort of reframe. I mean, for me, it's not just I gave a shit about like women who are my friends and my partners and my family, and just abstractly because they're humans, they're people, and and for so long. The comic book industry, but also culture as a whole, because we live in a massive toxic patriarchy. Culture as a whole doesn't really do right by women as much as it needs to.
Absolutely not.
There's not equity.
I grew up like one of the girls who thought that I must be so different from other girls because I didn't relate to, the Barbie and princess stories. Not really realizing that I didn't relate to them because they weren't written by women. And, the girls in the stories were nothing like me because they're nothing like most girls, And I mean, sure, there are girls out there who like things to be pink and pretty and clean, and that's awesome. That's one side of femininity, but there's so many sides, and there's so many sides of masculinity, and little boys need stories about strong women just as much as little girls do. It's so, and we all need, stories of people who look different, people, that's why She-Ra is so fucking dope, because there's, a main character who's pear-shaped, because there's, a main character who's, brown and has 2 dads, because, it just normalizes people being different from each other, and that being not even an issue that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and that's and it's just what I was saying before. It's just literally we've had so much of just we've seen so many things, and the reason the stories feel tired is because we're telling the same story over and over again, and we're excluding these other perspectives, and we're excluding these other voices, and we're not telling stories for everybody, And part of what I love so much about comics is the potential of it all. There's no, it doesn't have to be limited. It doesn't have to be, Spider-Man fights the Hulk, every other issue. It has, all it is visual storytelling. And because of that, there is absolutely no fucking reason that this cannot represent more of the world and represent you and represent, people who have traditionally not been served here. And so it's as a person who thinks about social justice on a lot of different levels, comic books, because they're such a big thing for me, it breaks my heart that comics are not more progressive. And then when things do sort of evolve, in such a way that it's there's there's aspects of it, then I get excited, and I
Yeah.
want to shout it from the rooftops.
I mean, I'm just thinking now, I briefly mentioned Why the Last Man earlier in the conversation, which was, it's one of my all-time favorite comics, but I mean, think about that. So I was like 18 when I discovered that comic and started reading it and, fell in love with it. And that is a story in which every man on planet Earth dies spontaneously except one. So the entire story is populated by women, but guess who the main character is? A white guy. In this story in which there is only one man left on Earth. He is our protagonist. He is the guy we're supposed to be interested in. Like, okay, like, yeah, of course there are female characters, and we see, how their lives progress in light of this situation, and their stories and their struggles. But it's very like, I mean, I think it was written by men, at least in the beginning, and yeah, there's a little bit even to the concept of like what would happen if the girls had to be in charge. It's like, okay.
Well, that's exactly what you're saying. So like and you could argue like, and this is what a lot of people have argued. I don't know that I necessarily buy this all the time. Sometimes it gets thrown around and it feels a little bit like self-aggrandizing or like padding, but like, you could argue, well, it's like a Trojan horse because like, that way, because most of the readership is male, that way if there's a male protagonist, then they pay attention and it allows it to be made. And also the people who are publishing comics, like there's a whole argument there. And like, sometimes I buy that. Sometimes I think that's a little like, I don't know. It just feels a little in bad faith sometimes because it is also written by Brian K. Vaughan, who is as far as I know, a white dude.
Right,
so
right.
it's a little tricky. But I am glad to see, and I do think that it's funny because in some ways, going back to what I was talking about before, I think that the future of the industry is, and this is the word of the century, uncertain. You see that in commercials all the time. I always laugh when they're like, "In these uncertain times." But yeah, like I think that with the actual physical print industry, and also comic book, the main comics are getting more into digital, which has been around for years. Web comics is a totally different format that like we haven't even touched on, and that's for years now people have been publishing self-publishing web comics that are amazing and interesting, and that's where you see like things that you would never see in a mainstream comic that is now owned by Disney.
Right, and yeah, which are less likely to be optioned for film or television, and kind of less beholden to that. And yeah, I agree. I used to read a few webcomics religiously. I don't have any right now. Are there any that you're reading that you'd recommend?
I've been a little out of the webcomic game for a bit. I do think that let's see, the ones that I know are, because also too a lot of interestingly enough, I think a lot of the webcomic talent has actually been poached by the print industry. But a couple of years ago, there was an awesome comic called Octopus Pie that I think that they actually have a collected edition that is really great. It's kind of like a slice of life sort of comic with like some manga influence, but mostly just sort of like funny, but also heartfelt, that I really liked. Love Me Nice was a good one too. Let's see, yeah, I did fall out of web comics just by virtue of like just, I don't know, just things sort of took the place of it.
For me, yeah, I think I used to read a lot more webcomics back when I used to use a desktop more, and I'm so my phone oriented these days, and I'm sure that they make them formatted for mobile, but yeah, I just haven't really thought about like trying to find something to read online.
You actually did jog my memory because I actually I'm so speaking of the sort of the mobile experience as it relates to the format. So there's this app that is like a very popular app that I think started in Korea called Webtoon, and that's kind of like the preeminent place in which you'll find free and also paid, sort of in like a Patreon style sort of format comics. And what I like about Webtoon is they've actually worked with a lot of creators and put a lot of thought into like, how do we present a format for mobile on your phone, which we're all on our phone, that is like that actually takes advantage of it versus is trying to sort of like ham-fistedly essentially make it work. And one of the comics that I love on Webtoon is Lore Olympus. Lore Olympus, which is basically a modern day romance retelling, or like romance novel or sort of romance comic style retelling of Hades and Eurydice. No, I'm sorry. Was it Eurydice? Hades and Persephone.
Yeah.
And it's like, so it takes the myth, and it's just it's gorgeously illustrated. I don't remember who the creator of it is. She illustrates and does the scripting as well, and it's gorgeous, and it's romantic, and it's nice because it's aimed at, like, you could tell it's aimed at teenage girls, which is so amazing to me. I'm like, yes, fucking finally,
make
we have
stuff for teenage girls. Make some good stuff for teenage girls.
Yeah, in this format, and also I love it too because it's well done, and so it's like that's kind of the thing. Like, I know it's not designed for me, a 35-year-old white guy living in New England who went to college. Like, I know it's not designed for me, and I still love it, and that's the testament to, like, if we can just get out of our heads that, like, you have to just almost ritually cater to these dirt bags like me. I include myself as one of them. That, like, there's so much out there that we can do. There's so much out there.
Yeah, totally. That's like the perfect place to leave it.
I think I'm not going to get much more profound than that anyway.
I feel like we should just plan on doing a part 2 at some point, because this is such a rich topic, and I would love to spend another hour talking about it. But for now, once again, Gray Bouchard, look at Gray Bouchard and the Dedication, Salem Wolves, and when is the new EP or LP coming out?
So Salem Wolves has an LP coming out. Now I'm going to be a little vague about this because I kind of want to do the whole Beyonce thing and surprise people.
Okay.
But
That's your right.
it is going to be coming out in the next few months. So just keep your eyes on the skies.
All right, very good. And are you still doing any kind of like song of the day? Can we find you doing your thing, or are you just getting ready to be a dad and have kind of dropped that for the moment?
Well, I'm trying to juggle things as best I can. We do have plans through the occasions to put out a few more songs of the not maybe songs of the day, but maybe songs every couple of weeks. Originals. We have a fun cover in the tank, which I think I'm excited to hear the light of day. So yeah, just keep an eye on us on Facebook and YouTube, and you'll see something pretty soon, I think, there.
Very cool. Well, great. Thank you again for joining me. This was really fun. Thanks for listening to More Music Please Quarantine Beat. Follow the show on Instagram at moremusic.podcast and check out the website moremusicpodcast.com for new episodes. Questions or comments, email moremusic.podcast@gmail.com. Thanks to DJ Scully, Michael Cadnar, and James Stewart for the catchy theme song you're hearing now. I'm MK Burnell. Talk to you next time.